Welcome to this first installment of Global Civics. It's a first in a 6-part series of public seminars on a complex subject that concerns the rights and responsibilities of citizenship in the 21st century. I'm going to start with a little monologue and a few disclaimers and explain how we're going to go about this and your roles in it as we progress. First, I'm not here to teach global civics, but rather to conduct this experiment in multidisciplinary and multimedia education. I'm not in a position to instruct my peers, let alone folks in attendance who are more learned and experienced than I am. My role does go well beyond facilitation. I have the privilege and the burden of setting forth some propositions and guiding a conversation about them. But my job stops way short of command and control. This is sort of an open source environment. Everything I'll be presenting to you could be done better. I'm open to suggestion and to constructive criticism. This is a good time to acknowledge that we're dealing with a cluster of controversial subjects. There's only one rule of engagement. That's civility. Mutual respect is one of the requirements of the course. There are no other formal prerequisites, no assignments, no tests. There will be a quiz. I've prepared a short bibliography of recommended readings and a list of information sources, which is in a little pile there next to the door on that table. I want to urge all of us to keep a media log for the duration of the course. Keep track of where you get your information. I want you to know where I'm coming from, and that's the main purpose of the bibliography. It's not to throw a list of books and other things at you, but just to let you know these are my sources. I don't have original ideas. There will be a pop quiz at the end of each evening. It will be on world geography, and it will be lots of fun. This is a reality television program as well as a course for students, teachers, and lifelong learners. It won't be edited, and for the most part, it won't be scripted. This is the scripted part right here. It will be telecast locally and statewide in November and December, following the 6 progressive weeks starting now and ending on November 5th. This series is a distillation of a semester-long curriculum unit. It's densely packed. We're taking a mile-wide, inch-deep approach, and at the same time building a model for application in Montana and across the world. I'm not going to apologize for barely touching the surface of these deep subjects, because after all, we know most of what happens that's interesting is on the crust of the earth and on the surface of our lives. I take global civics very seriously because I think we're in a make-or-break period in the history of civilization. But I must tell you that I'm married to a geologist. She often reminds me that the human race scarcely counts for anything in the fullness of cosmic time. And I'm quoting her, "We'll be lucky if we humans even make it into the fossil record of this planet." So I take it seriously, but I'm humbled at the same time. A few acknowledgments and introductions. Before we get started, I want to thank the Greater Montana Foundation for funding this operation, the Montana Historical Society for hosting it, and my colleagues at Helena Civic Television for enabling me to undertake this special project. I want to recognize our executive director, Kirsten Fabian, who is also directing the videotaping from a booth behind you. She has assistance from camera operators from Carroll College, Jordy Blaine and Seth Rojas. Kelly Webb, right here, will be assisting me with all sorts of technical tasks, so we're going to call her our key grip. I'm sure in the weeks ahead I'll be getting help with PowerPoint presentations from 2 students at Helena College. Our own Dave Clark is here. He's over there fiddling with the camera at the moment to make sure the sound system works and that the cameras operate correctly. Lauren Fredrickson put together the photo collage you see on the screen behind me. Before I introduce several of our regular discussants here on the stage, just a word about microphone etiquette. You must use one. We have to share. There are 2 there, there's 1 here, there's 1 over there. And it's critically important that when you're speaking, you actually are speaking into the mic. And these wireless microphones up here for our discussants require you to be pretty close. You don't have to be touching it, but not much more than an inch is going to do the trick. Same goes for the microphone over there that's placed for audience participation. And when we get to that stage of the evening, Kelly's going to run one of these up down the other side so people don't have to go all the way to one side to speak their minds. It's a little bit awkward, and I don't want it to be frustrating, but without sound, we don't have a good television program. That's basically it. It's not about hearing one another in this room. It's mostly about going on the record on tape. So, we have 4 discussants with us this evening, and maybe you could stand where you are when I introduce you. Now, I'm giving these are very cursory introductions. These are people with a long resume and lots of accomplishments, and I'm just giving you the bare bones. But Dr. Jeanette Fruguglia is Associate Professor and Chair of the History Department at Carroll College. Mr. John Driscoll is a former Speaker of the House, a Public Service Commissioner, and I believe a graduate of the Army War College. Ms. Terry Kendrick is Special Projects Advisor to our Superintendent of Public Schools, Denise Juneau. I noticed the sound changed. I hope it's better. And Tia Kelly is Professor of Business at Helena College. She's filling in for Dr. Denise Runge, the Dean at Helena College. At our future gatherings, Dennis Taylor will also join the panel of regulars, and former Supreme Court Justice Jim Nelson will be with us on October 29th. We've issued an open invitation to several elected officials to join us when their schedules allow, and I hope that happens. Now, on with the show. But first, a preview. I do want to explain very briefly the arc of the course. As I said before, it's a much compressed version of a long, involved curriculum unit. And I've elected to offer up a perspective, and I want to give you an overview of how we're going to approach tonight and the next succeeding 5 weeks. So my assistant here, Key Grip, is going to reveal an awesome piece of art. You don't have to criticize this. I already know I need help with graphic arts. But I hope you can see it, and I just want to explain what it's about. I want to set a context for the discussion, and the context is globalization, and that's the subject we're going to dwell on this evening. That context is viewed and experienced from a Montana perspective. So I think you'll see a little family of Montanans looking out at the world and wondering what's going to happen, what's happening, what are we going to do about it, what are we supposed to do about it as citizens. They are looking at the world as we know it tonight and for here on after through a framework of analysis. There's a triangular configuration there that's like a prism, and we're going to view global civics through this prism. And these are 3 tightly interrelated principles that are distilled from a lot of other ideas. At the top of the pyramid is sovereignty, which is the central organizing principle of government in the world. The sovereign state is the ultimate authority legally on this planet. And there are all kinds of sovereignty. There's limited sovereignty, which is an oxymoron, but it's reality. So we're going to deal with sovereignty next week. And Montana is a wonderful place to tackle this complicated subject because obviously we're part of the nation state of the United States, a sovereign country. We have state sovereignty within a federal system, and it says so in our Constitution. You know, Montana is a sovereign state. But it's limited, and we need to know how and why. We also have an abundance of tribal nations that have sovereignty of a sort. So it's a great place to get involved with the subject. And the subject is evolving as we speak. The second principle to view the world through is one of legitimacy. There are all kinds of governments in the world and in the United States, Some of them are democratic, a lot of them are not. Many of those that claim to be democratic are not really democratic. They are procedurally democratic or nominally democratic. We have some of those problems ourselves with our democracy. So democracy is not the main thing to focus on. Is the government, is the society, are the rulers legitimate? So monarchical societies are legitimate even if they're not democratic, so long as the people from whence sovereignty arises are treated well. I'll just leave it at that. So week 3, we're going to take a look at legitimacy. And I'm going to back up just for a minute, because when we back up to sovereignty, think about the headlines. Think about the news of the world. The people of Scotland voted to be an independent country. They didn't win that vote, but they were going to become an independent country if they got more than 50% of the votes. It was legal, it was legitimate. Catalonia in Spain, the people there want to do the same thing. The Constitution of Spain does not allow a secession vote like that, but the people may act on their own. So we'll see. That's going to happen later this year. Going down to legitimacy, we have what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. Russia's annexation of Crimea, was it legitimate? It's a de facto accomplishment, but legitimacy is another thing. And actions like that may not have long-lasting effect if they really are illegitimate. So that's where we look at legitimacy. And we can look at any kind of system of government, and at the bedrock of it, if it's legitimate, it's probably going to last. If it's not, there's going to be trouble. And there are a lot of illegitimate regimes in the world. Many of them are in the Middle East. And we've witnessed, the Arab Spring, Egypt's failed democratization, things like that. So we're going to take a look at the world through the prism of legitimacy. The third, and the most obscure term on my art here, is subsidiarity. People don't use that word very often. The Catholic Church, many hundreds of years ago, came up with the concept, not by themselves, but the whole idea of subsidiarity is the best government is the government that is closest to the people. So here in Montana, once again, we have a tradition and a constitutional system that supports local control of school boards. It's like basic democracy. States' rights are part of this subsidiary. Any federal system has subsidiarity built into it. So we're going to take a look at American federalism. We'll take a little look at Canadian federalism, Mexican federalism, Russian federalism, which is sort of fake federalism. And then the big experiment in subsidiarity, where this principle is actually enshrined in treaties, is the European Union, where 27 countries have decided to pool their sovereignty, to give up a lot of it for the greater good, on the basis that integration is a good thing, but government close to the people is better than government from way on high or way far away. Now, the most questionable thing I'm offering to you is, well, what is this really all about? And I'm posing the possibility that history has a trajectory. We're going somewhere as a civilization. It's not just random. We have purpose. Where that purpose comes from is arguable. But I sense myself that we are striving as a civilization to achieve a status, a condition where human rights are universal. Everybody has what they need. Everybody is responsible to one another as citizens. So it's not just about human rights. Human rights involves human responsibilities. But to me, that is the end game in time, is to achieve a planetary civilization where human rights are enshrined. It's the law of the land, it's the law of nations, it's the law of the world. Not saying that there's going to be any government that runs the world. That's not what this is about. It's just that I can't think of a better direction to be going than toward the actual realization of human rights for all people. And people have their whole people. They don't just have political rights. And they don't just have economic rights or social rights. They need the whole bundle together to be fully human. So that's my proposition. Lastly, the last week we're going to spend is on global governance. Not government, but governance. What are we going to do to implement human rights? To make progress, incremental, slow, fast, radical or not, we're going to have to figure out new ways to associate with one another to achieve the end of human rights. And a lot of the energy and activity that I'm thinking about that we're going to talk about, it may involve government, but it's not about top-down. It's not about laws and enforcement of laws alone. It's about non-governmental agencies, organizations. It's about faith-based communities. It's about individual initiative. There are all kinds of things that are being tried and all kinds of things that haven't been tried to actually accomplish these ends. Because in the end, I guess the other proposition I'm laying out is that we cannot even hope to achieve this trajectory, to reach these heights, organized the way we are into sovereign states on the planet. We're going to have to get beyond that. And as we'll learn, lots of people are pushing the boundaries of international law as we speak, mostly because the problems we're facing do not conform to boundaries, to borders. And we're going to talk about that now. So, without further ado, the plan for the evening is I'm going to show this PowerPoint. It shouldn't take too long. I've got a clock here to remind me not to dwell too long on any particular point. Depending on how long it lasts, after it's over, we're going to immediately launch into a discussion with our four distinguished discussants. They're going to comment and question and criticize or whatever. They're going to speak to the presentation. Then we'll take a break. And if I take too long, we'll take a break before they start. It'll just depend. After they've had an opportunity to go back and forth on it, we will take a break, and then it's your turn as members of the audience, as lifelong learners, students, teachers, to get engaged in the conversation as well. And then I have a few placeholders if we need them as time goes by. We are going to finish within the 90 minutes, so we'll be done at 8:30. But before we're actually done, there will be a pop quiz. You can't prepare for it now. You have no idea what I'm going to ask you. But I do. So, without further ado, we're going to switch gears here on the screen and go to a PowerPoint. So once again, what I want to do with this presentation is establish a context, and the context is globalization. It's probably always a good time to quote Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but this is especially a good time to use a statement from him from 1945. This is towards the end of World War II. And as you know, that's when America rose to globalism. We weren't really a major power in the world as significant as we are now before World War II. At the common core of America's rise to globalism is an empathy for the world and a recognition that our responsibilities extend beyond our borders. I'm going to start with a big picture concept. There's a professor at Harvard named Stephen Walt who he published an article that said, a master's degree in international affairs in 5 minutes. And it took about 6 minutes to read his article. This is the core of the article. If you grasp these concepts, you kind of have a basic understanding of how the world works. First is anarchy. I'm not going to read these, but there's no higher authority than the nation state. And of course, there's a large variety of states in the world. We're the big one. There are other big ones, and there are many, many. There's about 196 countries in the world, and they are all legally sovereign. But anarchy rules because international law has no means of enforcement other than through certain institutions that we'll talk about later. The balance of power, you all know about the balance of power. It's always going on. Major countries are vying for position, and it's all relative to other countries' position. And when the balance of power is starting to shift, we're going to have trouble. I mean, just think about what's going on between the United States, Russia, and China, let alone other countries that matter hugely. We're doing a lot of business with China, but we're also pivoting to Asia with our Navy and preparing, as we must, to do battle with China in some fashion. And it's all about balancing power on the earth. Comparative advantage is sort of the basic principle underlying international trade. Economists, almost all of them will agree that at least in strict scientific terms, freer trade is better for everybody, and it's been proven out since the late 18th century. In other words, even if a country has absolute advantage in the production of any one thing, it still makes sense to trade because the benefits from trading flow back to the people. It's kind of a complicated subject, but it's easy to grasp. Number 4 is very important. Misperception, miscalculation. It's amazing. Our government and other governments have armies of intelligence experts, foreign policy experts, advisors all over the world, and yet leaders still do remarkably stupid things. And if you are interested in how the First World War got started, it's a prime example of miscalculation and misperception. That no war is inevitable. World War I was not inevitable. It was a lot of bad decisions. And that is something we can't escape. People do stupid things. Social construction is a little academic, but the main idea is that the world made up of nations and states, cultures, religions, regional groups, businesses, it's not ordained that this is the way the world has to be fashioned and constructed. We make these things up as we go. We've created this world. And we can change it. Now, quickly, there are some counterpoints to each one of these points. In other words, yeah, it's great to have international relations in a nutshell, but every one of these has contradictory realities. For example, with respect to anarchy, there are demonstrable examples of desire. Every leader in the world basically wants to conform to international law and international norms. There's a collective desire to do the right thing. And that runs contrary to anarchy. With respect to balance of power, there are concerted efforts to construct inclusive alliances and universal institutions. NATO wants to grow bigger to include the former Warsaw Pact, the enemy countries of the former communist world. So, and the United Nations is a universal organization. So, balance of power doesn't have to be the guiding principle forever. Free trade based on comparative advantage does not satisfy all needs, aspirations, and values. We know that increasingly. There are ways to mitigate miscalculations. For example, the hotline between Washington and Moscow in the Cold War was installed to prevent too many miscalculations. And without that kind of communication, the whole Cuban Missile Crisis could have destroyed. They could have destroyed the world if not for doing the right thing in terms of communicating directly. Many people believe in covenants with God and mystical nationalism. So that's the counterpoint to social construction. I can say, and these professors can say, it's all, we've made this world ourselves, but a lot of people don't believe that. And they don't behave as if we've made it ourselves. They have expectations that come from beyond. Okay. A major feature of globalization is economic interdependence. You've all heard of Adam Smith, I think. You know, he wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, you know, at the dawn of the United States coming into the world. It's a fabulous book, actually, and it's the basis of our understanding of modern international commerce and international trade. And one of the points he made is, well, like, why, you know, we just seem to always want to be trading stuff. It's in our nature to exchange goods and services. There's no other driving compulsion. It's a human propensity. Traditionally, land, labor, and capital have always been regarded as the foundations of the wealth of nations. I mean, they still are. Land, labor, and capital are still basic. However, in the modern world, especially in the 21st century, there's new combinations of words to describe economic reality and interdependence. Knowledge, information, and materials, and anxiety. And I'll explain these people. The guy on the right is Peter Drucker, who is a management theorist, very famous, and he came up with the whole idea of the knowledge economy, that's where the future is. It's what you know, not necessarily what you have in the ground or in your territory. It's what you can do with it, and that's all about the mind. And, you know, the whole emphasis on STEM these days, science, technology, engineering, and what's the other one? Math. That's what the knowledge economy is built on. The guy down on the left is John Kenneth Galbraith, another famous 20th century economist, who wrote a book called The Age of Anxiety. And I think we can all appreciate that anxiety exists perhaps to a greater extent throughout the world society than it ever has. At least among the advanced industrial countries, we have a lot of anxiety. Can't measure it, but it's a factor in the interdependence that we experience. The couple in the middle, that's Kenneth and Elise Goulding, Nobel Prize winners. These are all aging people, or they're long gone. But they were kind of pioneers in futurism. They were the first to sort of come out and say, we have to think of the world as a whole system. As economists, they said that. So these are people that count in the development of interdependence. A few basic things about international trade and investment. These are comparisons, or sort of looking at the way things have been recently and the way things are. And I won't go through all of them, but you've probably all heard of the International Monetary Fund and its acronym IMF. The IBRD is the World Bank. The ITO was never created, but it was supposed to come into being, and it was going to regulate international trade. The world fell short of that. People weren't willing to give up as much sovereignty as that would require, so they came up with an organization called the World Trade Organization. These are institutions born of a conference in the late 1940s at Bretton Woods, and that's all I'm going to tell you about that, because there's a trick. These days, right now, these institutions are still very powerful, but for example, the IMF is the lender of last resort. When a country can't pay its bills, the IMF may bail them out with conditions. The United States it's organized so that the people who pay the most into the fund have the most votes to decide where the funds are going to be spent. So the United States has a preeminent role in how the fund operates. The same goes for the World Bank. They go out and fund big projects like dams and agricultural development. It was created to restore Italy after the Second World War. It was totally demolished. So Italy was the first recipient of World Bank support. The WTO is sort of like a referee shop. When countries disagree about subsidizing trade, unfair trade practices, they go to the WTO and they arbitrate and try to figure out a solution. It's like going to a court. And sometimes they come up with solutions, sometimes they don't. These organizations are still powerful, but they're being superseded fairly rapidly by new constellations, groups of countries. And I'm throwing out these acronyms because I know you're going to encounter them. You probably have already, and you may not ever realize, well, what are they talking about? What are BRICS? Well, with the United States, role in the world economy subtly but inexorably decreasing relatively. We are not shrinking, but our power in the world is decreasing in relation to other countries as they come on. So BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Those are regarded as fast emerging, high growth areas in the world economy. PIGS is not a very pleasant acronym. These are the people most at risk within the European Union in the Eurozone crisis, the Euro crisis. That's Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. They are suffering the most, have done in recent years, with very high unemployment, all kinds of debt problems. So they're lumped together as PIGS. And of course, people like to comment on the pigs at the trough of the IMF or at the trough of the European Union bailouts or bail-ins. MINS stands for Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey, and the S is simply a plural. So this list, and I could dwell on it, but I'm not going to. I will mention some of the things you need to know about as we consider global civics, and especially the international economic component of global civics, is that the world is on the verge of, or they're trying to negotiate very, very major, large free trade area blocks. Can't seem to get it together as a whole world to adopt free trade principles, to do away with subsidies and other kinds of unfair competition. So we're going into blocks. So TPP is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It would involve the United States and a large number of groups in the Asia-Pacific region, excluding China. The TTIP is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which would put the United States in a partnership with the European Union in a free trade area. If these were to go forward, there would be a lot of economic benefit, a lot of economic growth. Material conditions in the world should and probably would improve greatly. However, they're stuck in the mud right now. These agreements may never come to pass. One of the key elements in the United States is in order to pass a major free trade agreement, they're not really treaties, they are executive agreements. Nevertheless, in the United States, the Congress has the authority to award the president trade negotiation authority. In other words, the United States goes and negotiates with the European Union or all these Asian Pacific nations, and they come up with all these detailed formulas for freer trade, less restriction, less regulation, more conformity, more rules and more harmonization of standards. All those details then have to go to the Congress. And if the Congress doesn't grant the president trade negotiation authority, everything comes undone. So the United States, as the country that promotes free trade more assiduously than anybody else, is hamstrung to a certain degree by this idea that the Congress can just whittle away at the package. And therefore, other countries who have more centralized governments are unwilling to negotiate a lot of things with the United States because they know it's not going to hold if Congress takes a whack at it as soon as it's done. So you're going to hear a lot about that. The bottom line for international trade and investment, what drives, other than the propensity to trade, barter, and exchange, what's really driving all of this negotiation, all these organizations, all this effort to more fully integrate the world economy and make it more interdependent is the desire to reduce transportation and transaction costs. That's then and now. That's what's driving all this. Reduce the costs. That boosts profits, it boosts growth, it boosts incomes. It's more efficient. So, here's a sort of a definition of globalization with an economic perspective. I'm going to just touch on a few of these items. They're all important, but one key factor is that in the last 25 years, there's been a lot of really poor countries that used to be called, it was the North-South divide. We don't use those terms anymore. Now it's emerging markets and advanced industrial countries. The poorest countries are rising rapidly in relation to the rich. And that's a remarkable accomplishment mainly through trade and investment agreements and freer trade. So the poorest of the poor are still the bottom billion, but millions and hundreds of millions of people have come out of poverty through economic integration into the world economy. At the same time, within countries, the income disparity between the rich and everybody else is growing rapidly, and we certainly know that's the case in the United States. It's worse in other places. So it's kind of a paradoxical situation where global integration does bring people out of poverty, but without certain policies and rules in effect internally, it doesn't necessarily benefit the middle class. The middle classes of the world, or the rich world, are being squeezed. The middle classes of the emerging economies are the ones driving the upward growth. One of the problems of integration is capital, money. Big tranches of cash flow wherever investors want to take them. There is no control. Countries have given up controls on capital. They used to be there. They're not there anymore. So financial integration means money can go wherever it wants to go. And a lot of it goes offshore. A lot of money made in the United States and made in the world and taxable by the United States is sitting in offshore bank accounts all over, in the Caribbean, in Europe, elsewhere. There are a lot of benefits to mobile capital. It's flexible. People get to spend their riches where they want. They get to invest in places where they think the risks are relatively low, and the gains are going to be high. The problem is labor, the workers, are not mobile. We've become, as a world, less mobile than ever. Prior to World War I, there was greater labor mobility in the world than there is now. Immigration laws are at the root of this, or not the root, but they're a consequence of changing attitudes about immigrants and people moving around. So the masses of people are at a huge disadvantage because they are less mobile than the money it takes to build the jobs that they want to compete for. So it's a structural problem. I want to just, with respect to vulnerability to risk, shocks, and catalytic events, that lower left-hand image might not be quite so visible to you. That's the spot where Gavrilo Princip, a Serb, assassinated the Archduke of Austria, and that was the catalytic single event that caused a whole chain reaction of military mobilization and World War I, which was just a slaughterhouse. So I'm just using it to illustrate how in a world of interdependence, all kinds of interlocking alliances, commitments, investments, one little thing can touch off a conflagration. And that's perhaps a vulnerability that's created by interdependence, integration, association, and alliance. So on balance, globalization has done a lot of good it's furthered the ideal of economic integration. It has mixed effects on political autonomy. The jury is out on whether or not global interdependence, globalization, is actually helping cultures to evolve or destroying cultures very inexorably. It's certainly changing the way people interact, the way they identify who they are, where they're from. So, bottom line is globalization is a mixed bag. Not all good and not all bad. Danny Roderick is a very up-and-coming economist, again, from Ivy League school. He's been a free trade advocate until just recently, where he kind of started to figure out things aren't what they seem, that economists have been preaching freer trade and forgetting other important things. The globalization paradox, basically the arguments among economists and policymakers worldwide is less regulation, less government is better for business and trade. The paradox is, as an economist, he and others have gone in and analyzed, well, is that actually the case? And it's not. The most successful, richest, most productive, most efficient, most export-savvy countries in the world have big governments with strict regulations. And it goes against the grain of most modern economic thought, that you can have bureaucracy and liberal trade, and it can all work. So basically, you sort of come to grips with this quote, is that, democracies especially, we have the right to protect our markets, to protect ourselves from unfair competition, to protect ourselves from the slosh of global currency and money. We have that right. And the dilemma, this trilemma that he identifies is that, and it's a very convincing book. It's called The Globalization Paradox, so I recommend it to you. We can't do all these three things simultaneously. You can do any two. You can have more democracy and national self-determination, but you're going to have to give up on some of the globalization in the economy. You can have democracy and globalization, but you give up control, your self-determination. So any which way, you're going to have to give somewhere. And basically, he's coming to grips with having to give to the principle of democracy more than economists have been accustomed to do. Here's, no pictures here, but for many years now, the mantras of globalization are, economic growth is a necessity. We cannot create jobs fast enough to meet the needs of the population. In Mexico, for example, you could almost go to any country that's less developed than our own and see that without economic growth, people are not just going to be, the economy is not just going to stagnate. People are going to get poorer and poorer and poorer. There will be violence as a consequence. There will be class warfare. So growth is still the goal, and we certainly are familiar with that argument here in Montana. I mean, it's really, these days, it's mostly about economic growth. It used to be that you could kind of have both growth and sustainable development, and that's ecologically sustainable development. In other words, we can have more jobs, more stuff, more of everything, better life, and not destroy the planet as we get there. Increasingly, and it's happening fast now, that whole notion is starting to erode, that you can have sustainable development and sustained economic growth at the same time. Well, there's only one way out of it that we know, and it may not work, but we're at it as we speak. That is technological advancement in all areas of the economy, energy being principal one, and adaptive changes in human behavior. I mean, changing the way we live, how we spend our money, how we spend our lives. Right now, that's the trick that we're all playing together, to grow, to get more, but not destroy what we have. And that's an increasingly dicey proposition, which moves us to ecological interdependence. Everything is interrelated. Traditionally, and still today, the main measure of a country's wealth is the gross domestic product, which is the sum of the value of all the goods and services produced in the country. If you're comparing countries in economic terms, 90% of the time it's GDP. What is the GDP? It used to be called the gross national product, which adds in the expenditures of foreigner or residents of a country in foreign locales, it's really not very significant. So everybody's kind of landed on GDP as the main measure. However, this measure is inadequate to actually understand and where we're going and how we're going to get there. So I've just offered you a few examples. There's an index of ecological overshoot, which measures, how many resources are being consumed, and can we sustain that rate of consumption, let alone let it grow. So this Global Footprint Network has come up with a calculation. These are all highly data-oriented measures. We're basically spending 1.5 of the Earth's total resources now. And we're approaching, we're getting over 7 billion people. The exponential growth in population recently goes along with exponential demand for goods and services, for energy, for water, for everything. And we're overspending, let's put it that way. We're overspending right now. And we're facing a lot more people, a lot more mouths to feed, a lot more jobs to create. The Social Progress Index is more concerned with the holistic measure of well-being, housing, healthcare, education, and they look at all parts of the world. Where are different countries on this Social Progress Index? And as you might know, the countries at the top happen to be the Nordic countries in Western Europe, Scandinavia, other Western countries like France, Germany. We're up there, of course, the United States. But anyway, it's a much more holistic way to measure progress and well-being. The same goes for the Better Life Initiative. I'm not going to get into the details, but I urge you to go take a look at these. You can Google them, and they'll pop up right away. The most interesting and fascinating new development in terms of developing a barometer for well-being is the Gross National Happiness Index, which is the official index of the tiny little country of Bhutan, which borders India. It's between India and China. Tiny little country. It's a kingdom. It's a Buddhist country. It's a fascinating way to analyze well-being, and a lot of countries are looking into this and attempting through various means of adopting the Gross National Happiness Index. Well, we all know in terms of ecology that we're facing major league challenges here. I just picked three of the most obvious ones. And I'm not going to argue with anybody about climate change, what's causing it, how fast it's happening, whether it's a strange anomalous occurrence or whether it's a trend. I mean, the scientific community seems to be pretty settled on it's happening when we're going to expect more extreme weather. And what goes with that are water shortages and pandemics. It's not all about climate change, but these are ecological challenges at the planetary level. No one government, no assortment of governments can by themselves fix these. So we know that there are hundreds of millions of people who live near the ocean. New York City being one, island countries being another example on the other end of the extreme. They're going to have billions and billions of dollars they're going to need to invest just to protect their lives and their property if things continue the way they're going now. Extreme drought is really at the root of many international conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. Drought drives people crazy, and they start to covet what they don't have, which is water. And they're herdsmen, they have to find water. So the whole war in the Sudan, the atrocities in Sudan, the genocide in Sudan is rooted in drought. And there's drought areas all over the world. Agricultural areas, the productive areas of the world are starting to shift. And we know, for example, it's in North America, it's likely to move north. Like the most productive farmlands are going to be north of where they are now. And the whole panhandle, the grasslands of Texas may dry up. Yeah, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but this is where there are so many indicators that this is starting to happen. It happened more rapidly than we anticipated. Water has always been at the root of conflict. You know, way back when in olden times, they were called hydraulic regimes. You know, Babylon, the source of power of Babylon was the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, control of those rivers. Well, now there are lots of headwaters areas of the planet that are considered of incredible strategic value. One of the reasons why China will never relinquish Tibet is because it's the headwaters of Asia. There are other reasons, but that's fundamental. Turkey is at the headwaters of most of the rivers in the Middle East. It's a very important country, and there's going to be a lot of conflict over water. And, you know, water is for fighting out here in the Rocky Mountain West as well. Plagues and viruses do not acknowledge boundaries. We know that. We're dealing with the Ebola virus now, and there have been other viruses in the past. There have been plagues in the past. What we know for sure is it doesn't matter that there's a line separating one country from another when viruses are airborne or travel through bats. You know, what's the boundary? This just underscores, I think, the importance of working together across boundaries, beyond our national borders. We just cannot deal successfully with these kinds of problems on our own and within the confines of sovereign states. This gets a little bit more fun now. Another aspect of globalization is the merging of arts and culture and language. You might recognize the handsome gentleman there who goes all over the world eating on television, an enviable job. Afro-Celt Sound Machine is a fusion band. So this is what's happening that's positive, that all this intercultural exchange is creating new forms of art, new languages in a sense, a lot of literature in translation. All kinds of interesting creative things are coming out of globalization. Now, this is a slide I was afraid to build, and I'm afraid to show it to you, but I'm going out there. You know, the world is divided into nations and states, and they're not coterminous in many cases. There are very few nation-states. That is where one nation has its own state, and they are the dominant people within it. France, Japan, Germany, and then there's another German country called Austria. In other words, in most countries are multicultural. There are many nations within them. We are an immigrant nation, so we have the most integrated, fused society, intercultural, fused society. So, as globalization proceeds, each of us as individuals kind of has to deal with, well, all right, who am I? Who do I owe obedience, fealty? You know, not just who do I owe taxes to, but who is in command of me besides me? So, I'm throwing it out there that, you know, I am, like most people, different things at the same time. We have multiple identities within the shell of our cranium. I am an autonomous individual. I am certainly a Montanan. I'm an American, no doubt about it. I'm all these other weird things put together: spiritual humanist, patriotic, lapsed Catholic, libertarian, socialist, entrepreneurial citizen of my neighborhood, this town, my country, North America, and the world. One of the problems for people like me, and it may be true for people like you, there is no political party that matches my identity. In the United States or anywhere, there is no political party that actually represents me. And I don't think I'm an anomaly in that sense. But that's a problem for our politics. So in short, I'm very happy to tell you I'm a walking, talking oxymoron. And the challenge I offer to you is, well, what about you? And who are we all together as citizens of the same country, the same locality, the same world? Getting towards the end of the globalization here, but obviously social media is having a profound influence, especially among younger people, on their connections. Younger people, and not just Americans, especially, I mean, they're Europeans, Africans, Asians, everybody is leapfrogging national boundaries and national consciousness by making direct contact as individuals. We host lots of foreign delegations here in Helena, Montana, year after year, mostly of younger people. They establish friendships and connections with people in our community. And if they're into social media, that establishes a pattern, a communication platform that has no respect for where your passport comes from. However, I think this is a very unstable situation. We don't know if it's going to last. I mean, some people posit that these neural networks, these exchange of ideas between people all over the planet all the time using, through wireless communications, that's the way we're going to get past nationalism quickly. People are way more wedded to their interpersonal connection than they are to their national identity. Maybe. The thing we have to worry about there is the neural network is still under the control in most places of a central government. The Russians can tamp down the internet. China decides what's going to be on the internet. Iran decides what's going to be on the internet. So we're a long ways from being free of that kind of interference. Connectivity seems to be, the bellwether of economic development at every level. Broadband is now considered an essential, almost utility. Without broadband, communities cannot grow, they can't develop, they can't trade, they can't get to where they want to be. With broadband, a small business in Montana or anywhere on the planet can become a successful business if they know how to use the internet. But, and I think it's a big but, what happens if the internet crashes? There are all kinds of reasons why that could happen. Some of them are just natural disasters. Solar activity, asteroids, things that happen that are far beyond our control could bring the internet down. But probably a more likely cause for a crashing internet is a very sophisticated terrorist operation. What better way to stop the United States, to damage Europe, to wreak havoc in the international global economy than to make the internet not function for a day or a week or a month or for generations? We'd be back in the dark ages, so to speak, without access to these neural networks. Transactions, banking, everything is now internet-based. So I have a kind of a morbid expectation that I'm going to experience this, and I hope I'm wrong. But I think as we're thinking about the future and how to be good global citizens, I guess my caution is we shouldn't be overly dependent on something that can be so easily manipulated or destroyed, if even just for a short period of time. Geopolitics is sort of back in conversations about the world, and this is where geography comes in. Geography still matters hugely. Now, I should preface this with there's all kinds of measures out there, polls, questionnaires, that prove that people in the United States in particular are geographically illiterate. An amazing percentage of people don't know where Afghanistan is. They can't find Iraq on the map. And here we are, involved still in major wars, major military activity in areas that people don't have a sense of where that is. Well, why should it matter? Well, it matters because geographic position on the planet always matters in terms when you're thinking about waging war, thinking about not waging war, thinking about forming an alliance, thinking about forming a new trade bloc. Geography matters hugely.
There have been some major ideas that have guided the world and the United States in particular in the 20th century and before. I'll just give you a few because these are kind of famous names in geopolitical history. Sir Halford Mackinder, a British guy, wrote this book called The Geographical Pivot of History, and that little diagram at the bottom is all about the heartland theory. And if you look at it, you'll see what is the pivot area? What is the most important land area on the planet to control? It's basically Russia. Well, that concept came about, ironically, after the age of exploration, when sea power was very important. In the Napoleonic era, the British Empire was built with ships going abroad. Well, with the advent of industrialization and railroads, everything changed so that people like Mackinder thought it's really about who controls the land mass that has the most resources. That's the pivot of history. And if you command the heartland, you really can control the world. A contrary view from another American was that, wait a minute, it's all about command of the oceans. If you have a superior navy and a means of fueling the navy and places to dock the ships when they need refueling and food and all that, you're going to be in the driver's seat of the global political world. So the Navy is the guarantor of our freedom. He was succeeded by another American. He's a Yale scholar, Speakman, kind of a disciple of both. And he decided that, let me go back just for a second, that the rim lands are the most important pieces of real estate on the earth in terms of controlling the future and controlling the economy and in controlling freedom. So the rim lands are coincident with what's the inner marginal crescent. So that's the Middle East, the periphery, Western Europe, the periphery of Asia, Japan. So if you think about Japan, the Middle East, and Western Europe, if you have control over those properties, those areas, you're top dog in the world. That concept gave rise to the main idea that fueled American foreign policy for most of our lives. And George Kennan, the fellow on the right, was the architect of containment. The idea was, when the Soviet Union was born and communism took hold and Stalin built this amazing, huge industrial machine of Soviet Russia, we had a choice. I'm just making shorthand of a very complex story, as you all know. We had a choice. We could have gone to war and see who wins. This is even before the advent of nuclear weapons. Lots of Americans advocated, do it now. Beat them now, or we're going to be at war with these people forever and we might lose. The counter-argument was, no, war is too costly, it's insane. All we have to do is contain communism within a certain sphere. So that was the policy that created NATO and all the other alliances that surrounded the communist world, including China. And to this day, the Chinese believe that we're still about containment, that all of our Asian pivot, all of this reorientation of military resources to the Asian-Pacific area is just another chapter in the history of containment. Instead of Soviet Russia, now it's capitalist/communist China that needs to be contained. But all of that has given rise to a much more ambitious concept of strategy and geopolitical rivalry. And this is right out of the United States playbook. That is full spectrum dominance. The way to control the future of the world is to own the oceans, contain your enemies, and above all, rule space. So we have space-based weapons, space-based surveillance, space-based a lot of things. And if you have the land, the sea, and space, no one can trump whoever holds that position. It's a scary position to take, that we really are ambitious to be dominant in so many spheres, but that's a plan. because of nuclear weapons primarily, the whole notion of geopolitics is now melded with geoeconomics. In other words, the role of economics in terms of competition among nations for preeminence is much stronger now than it ever has been. That's because geopolitical old style is suicidal. You know, during the Cold War, before the Soviet Union fell apart, there were enough weapons, way more than enough weapons to actually, destroy the world many times over. We still have the capacity to turn the world into a republic of insects and grass, which is a famous line from a guy who wrote a book about nuclear winter. So if you set aside the use of nuclear weapons and massive military confrontations, well, then the main area of competition is in the world of economics. So we have a lot of conglomerations operating on the surface of the earth right now. The West, which is primarily the Euro-Atlantic countries, Western Europe, the United States, and a non-European country, Japan, still comprise largely what's known as the West. And they are not only just Euro-Atlantic, they come from a root called Christendom. They're regarded as Christian countries, by and large. However secular they may be today, that's a defining cultural characteristic. The rest of the world is Asia and Africa. Latin America is floating around, sometimes in the West, sometimes not. But the vast majority of people do not live in the West, and they have other ideas about organization. NATO is still the number one military alliance. No one, at least by conventional measure, can beat NATO if it does what it wants to do with concerted effort. There is a rival organization that involves China and Russia and a number of other countries in Asia that's made to counteract the influence of NATO worldwide. So they're trying to push the West, through economic terms mostly, out of Central Asia, the heartland. The European Union, you know about it, it's 27 countries. This is, the largest group, the largest economy is collectively in the world, all those countries together. Holding firm, the Eurasian Union is a fabrication of Russia to reconstruct the Soviet Union in economic terms. So first stop is Ukraine. Second stop will be Kazakhstan, a huge oil-rich country in Central Asia. And they'll want to build on that. I'm going to skip to the end here. This guy, the picture, is Francis Fukuyama. He's a scholar at Stanford. He wrote a book that everybody, it's a big book, lots of attention, called The End of History. It was a book heralding the triumph of advanced capitalism and democracy after the demise of the Soviet Union. The world basically had come to an end. There was nowhere else to go. Everyone was now going to be able to become capitalist and democratic, and that's as good as it's going to be. Well, he's taken huge amount of criticism for being so arrogant in a sense. He's not an arrogant person at all, but it's an arrogant title. And we know that the end of history ended very quickly. We're in a huge, complicated mixture of ideas and concepts with the rise of extremist Islam, the restoration of Russia as a power. In other words, the story's not over. We haven't achieved human rights, for crying out loud. So, history has not stopped. And we have to think about ourselves in this context. We fit right into this picture. We have, our state's economy is led by exports. With only 1 million people, but lots of oil and gas and wheat and productive farmland and forests and all that, we're always going to be exporting half of what we make or more. 85% of what, the wheat grown is exported to other countries. There's kind of a renaissance in high technology manufacturing born of foreign investment back into the United States. That's a promising arena. With only 1 million people, we always are reliant on external sources of financial capital. People are pouring money into Montana. We don't have the wherewithal to generate enough ourselves to do very much with our own resources, with our own selves. We are a headwater state. Does that matter? It may matter hugely in the future. We're politically weak. You know, we're at the headwaters of the Missouri, but the downstream Missouri states have more political clout than we do. They have claims on our water. I think that will increase. We have a people who are kind of ambivalent about the North American Free Trade Act and other trade agreements. Montana is in a strange position where the gains from trade are not obvious. They're not as clear-cut as they are in most places of the world. So this is not a place where free trade is an easy sell. We are rapidly aging and urbanizing. I think the measure is within 10 or 15 years, over 80% of the people in the state are going to live in 7 cities, and we know what they are. At the same time, I don't know if we're actually diversifying, if our population is getting any less homogeneous than it is now. That's an interesting question going forward. Will we have more different people coming here and living here? And we have to think of Butte as, well, think of Butte this way. Butte is a singularity inside an anomaly ensconced in a variegated and amorphous transnational region with global connections. I'm sort of making light of the way Russia was described historically by Churchill. But Butte is worth looking at because it's the only industrial city in Montana. It's the only city where cowboys don't have a home. It's been tied to the global economy through minerals, resources, and exports, and big finance. And it attracted people from all over the world in its heyday. You know, is Butte something that can be restored and recreated and renewed in terms of globalization? Or are we going to be paying most attention to commodities trade, natural gas, oil, coal, things like that, products of farm and products of the earth, and not a major industrial and increasingly a high-tech center? So, I'm done, except for I'm putting forth a question. I'm going to read it, so you don't have to look at all those words. This is the question I'm laying out to the 4 discussants and to everyone here, and I think we'll take a break before we get into it. But here it is. We are at a pivotal moment, a turning point in the history of the human species. At this moment, I believe, more humans enjoy greater wealth, consume more resources, food, water, minerals, oil, gas, and so on, than ever before in history. As a result, at this moment, virtually the entire planet is integrated into a global system of resource extraction, production, processing, and distribution. But all of this modern industrial civilization writ large is now at significant risk. The great danger before us is resource depletion. So the question is, will globalization continue apace, or will it be arrested by natural disaster, social upheavals, or another world war? Something to ponder. We'll take a short break and come back, try to answer that question, and talk about anything else you want to with respect to the phenomenon of globalization. So, let's take a 10-minute break and come back.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Steve. That was really interesting, the first half. So thank you. And thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's a little late to think that globalization will not continue. That said, I think that natural disaster, social upheaval, et cetera, and the question here is, will it be arrested by? I said, I think it will be facilitated by all of those things, not stopped, not arrested. We can't, I mean, the Ebola, I mean, we think of Ebola, we think of ISIL, we think of the bad things, but I mean, I think of the good things as well, and the sort of positive note. I mean, I want to be Anthony Bourdain, right? But there's a lot of really positive things that come with globalization, and I think it's easy to get, stuck in the things that don't work, and where it goes wrong, and when we forget that on an airplane we can be in between Helena, Montana, and Casablanca, Morocco in 24 hours, and that's kind of really exciting. So those are my initial thoughts.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to answer the question directly, but I also want to thank Stephen. I thought that was a really provocative presentation and a lot of food for thought. So, the changing demographic in this country, I think it's going to make a big difference in terms of how we feel about globalization. People in my generation who were born at the time when the United States was sort of really at its most powerful, I think we tend to have more difficulty with globalization. And the younger generation, as Stephen pointed out, through their contacts with Facebook, with a ever diversifying population, at least in the country, if not in Montana, move between those boundaries really much more easily and see the world as see our country as part of a bigger context. The place that I have some difficulty, though, is the lack of civic education, or the decline in civic education in the schools, because I see where you have where you get a sense of power and a sense of belonging is if you know how your system works and where you can actually exercise your rights and your voice. And unless you're incredibly wealthy, people do that through their government, through participating in their local communities. And if we don't really focus on civic education and what that means in a global society, I think people might have friends on Facebook, but they may not feel like they have very much power in this global world.
Thank you. That was really good, provocative, Steve, the presentation. It was well worth the time spent. I think that globalization will continue apace, but it will be sporadic. It will not happen in many places where there is war and there is upheaval. To me, globalization is basically the result of electrification. Ever since the turn of the last century, most of the GNP for this country came about as a result of electrification or electricity end uses. Starting back with the telegraph, all the machinery, and now we're up to Facebook, and we're up to classes being delivered in the way that we're doing it right now. And airline reservation systems, you name it. And future globalization can only happen if electrification stays on track and more people get electrification and all the ensuing electricity-based technologies. To me, that's an absolute, after having been exposed to a whole lot of these kinds of issues over the years. And Montana is a great case study because we were in the Stone Age here. Just go out, step outside the door and see the atlatls and the bows and arrows. We were in the Stone Age here 160 years ago. There were a few flintlock rifles, but the majority of people that lived in this part of the world were in the Stone Age. And since that time, we've evolved from the telegraph in 1866 in October when the first kilowatt hour was generated and made it easier to communicate with Washington, D.C. than a many $100 stagecoach trip to what we have now, what we're doing tonight, and talking about other things like social networking systems and so forth. And we're seeing the implications of them on our televisions and Blu-ray and so forth in other countries as people use those systems. So I think it will continue apace, but I think it will be sporadic because there will be war, very definitely, and will probably involve us. And I think that we have to take steps at our local level to try to keep the fragments of culture that we are experiencing. We get them from everywhere, and they're pretty interesting. In case this electricity grid that we rely on so much no longer functions, I don't think of the internet going down. I think of the electricity grid going down, which is the source of a great deal of our wealth. There's a lot more to talk about, but a few thoughts, a few useful concepts I've picked up over the years that help think about this. At the War College, the concept of center of gravity. What is it you have to do to an opponent to defeat that opponent? Our center of gravity is a relationship between our people and our government and our military. And if any one of those things are severed, well, then we lose. Culminating point, which is when you throw a punch and you've thrown that punch and you've had your arm out there so far you can't punch any harder, that happens in militaries, and I believe we have that experience right now with our military. And then I will just draw your attention to a paper that a couple of Chinese colonels did after the last Taiwan Straits crisis back in the late 90s. They wrote a paper. They were supposed to think new thoughts about war, and they did a great job, and I recommend that it was interpreted by the CIA and the Foreign Broadcast Information Service. It's called Unrestricted Warfare. If you Google that and go through there and look for two Chinese people as authors, it's different from submarine warfare. It's using all your resources to achieve a very small objective. As opposed to us, we use all of our resources to save the world, and we don't have those kind of resources. And they talk about the Americans and how we treat every new technology as though it's red dancing shoes. We dance to the tune that the shoes want to dance to instead of pick the technologies that we need. And you'll notice that the Chinese have picked a combination of technologies, a very cheap combination that basically will burn down our fleets. I could talk more about this, but this is really quite interesting.
I agree that globalization will continue and I agree with the comments of my colleagues here tonight. But a little bit of different perspective that I have about it is that what I see in my students in the classroom and how excited they are to learn about other cultures and really how to go out and experience the world. They want to be trained. They want to be sensitive to others in countries and understand where they're coming from and how business works. And we see a lot of entrepreneurs come through the doors, wannabes at Helena College, and I think that this speaks loudly of what we'll see in the future, is their enthusiasm of wanting to continue to be sensitive to the cultures out there.
Thank each of you for your generosity to begin with, but for very thoughtful comments. Now, typically we would keep this conversation going amongst yourselves, and in the future there will be 5 or 6 of you there. In light of time, I want to invite the audience, members of the audience, to offer public comment on any of the material that we've talked about, and especially the comments each of you have made. I would invite you to ask a question of one or several of our discussants, and feel free to use the microphone. If you don't have anything to offer, one of the exercises that I would have liked to have taken us through, with time not wasted elsewhere, was looking at globalization through a prism called SWOT. You've probably all dealt with this way to analyze a situation: strengths, weaknesses, threats, and opportunities. I would ask you, each of you four, to just quickly kind of consider globalization in those terms. And you could just briefly identify one or several items in each category so that we can kind of have a cumulative sense of the potential that lies within globalization as it continues, or if it falters. So let's start once again with Jeanette. You can start. Sorry to give you such short time to answer a question, but I'm sure you can do it.
I don't know. That seems like a tall order. Okay. Give me a minute to collect my thoughts. I think if we're going to... Can I address one point?
Absolutely.
Before we,
you can address anything.
Okay. No, I mean, it's not that I don't want to do that. It's just while I collect myself. In 1983, Benedict Anderson wrote a very provocative book called Imagined Communities, in which he defined the nation state. and how the nation state doesn't really exist necessarily just on the ground, or in some cases it doesn't exist on the ground at all, but it in fact exists in our hearts and our minds. And this is a function of media, and sort of post-Gutenberg printing press media. And I think of Facebook, and I'm sure Benedict Anderson has a great deal to say about this. He gave a revised version of his book in 2006, and how our students are so connected by all of this social media, and how I had a history of the modern Middle East class in 2011, and we were right there on the ground with the Arab Spring in Egypt, and it was very exciting, and people were starting to rethink what it meant to be Egyptian and whatnot. And so I just would recommend that. And again, if right now the construct of globalization is in fact the nation state, because that's what we have, at least for now, we might want to think about how do we define that, and how do we think about that. So that's kind of my little pitch for read more about it. But to get back to this idea of globalization and strengths and weaknesses, maybe I'm an eternal optimist, but I think of opportunities. I think of the opportunities we have. If we're at a pivotal moment where we can destroy ourselves, and we have pandemics, and we have issues with water, and nations go to war over water much more than they really go to war over God, I think that we are at a moment with our students and our young people when we can say, but there's all these other opportunities that we have, and we can look at our strengths, and we don't have to use our strengths to make, and our opportunities does not mean we have to exploit the weaknesses of other places. So I guess that would be, I'm not stupid, but I think we have an optimistic moment.
I think the access to immediate information is both a strength and a weakness, so that I get most of my news from the internet. I'm on computer, and then I look at some of the news sites. And there's a lot of misinformation that comes across those sites, and it's not corrected. So people have really skewed views of what it means to be Muslim, or what the Middle East is really all about, because of the soundbite quality of news that we get. I mean, I was a bit taken aback when yesterday on the NBC Nightly News, they interviewed Ben Affleck, and I was like, really? Would Walter Cronkite ever have interviewed an actor, on the Nightly News? And that's sort of where we've come. So to me, it's how do you give people information in a way that's not overwhelming, so that they don't feel completely powerless? And yet I think we do have opportunities, but we're at a time in our life where we have to make some hard decisions and deal with big issues. And are people really willing to do that for the greater good? I think that's the question.
I just think that globalization has a great advantage of moving ideas quickly, as opposed to mimes, which is the latest first line in a news story, which are always eye catchers. But I mean, real ideas, moving those around. I was struck when Thomas Merton, before he died, he was in Asia talking to all the Tibetan lamas, and he really came to some important conclusions comparing the monasticism in the West with their life in the Tibet, and he did something good for all of us, and that was because of globalization. The other thing is about governments. The thing about the United States that most people don't realize, even though we have a Homeland Security Department, is we don't defend the homeland. We defend our Constitution. We're all sworn to preserve and protect our Constitution, which is not a land-based document. The Constitution is really remarkable for this modern era, because it provides an opportunity for other parts of the world to say, we want to be Americans and we're going to vote on it, and there's a process. Montana went through it back in 150 years ago and became a territory, but if there's even a process now for countries like Israel or for Palestine if they want to become American states. And I think it's something we should seriously think about as a two-state solution in the Middle East, for example, because the seas that keep us apart really no longer keep us apart. We got Ebola yesterday in and we had 9/11, 14 years ago, and the oceans just aren't what they used to be. And so we need to start thinking about different ways to look at our own country, but of course allow other people to decide whether or not they want to be part of it.
My outlook on the globalization still is, I agree with innovation, and I also think too that there'll be less selfishness among people, because I think we'll realize that we can't survive just on our own, that we have to get along with other countries and realize that if we're going to continue to be innovative and move forward and have growth and to have peace, that we need to be acceptance of everyone.
Well, thank you for that. And once again, if there's anybody out there in the audience, please approach the microphone and give us a sense of what you're thinking.
Marshall Gately, appreciate this, Steve, and I don't think you went overboard, and time, I think that was very appreciative. And and I appreciate the panel, but I was thinking here, I may have appreciated a panel that will get something done if you had had a 5, a 10, a 15, and 20-year-old. Most of us here will have our theories, but those are the people that's going to make a difference in how this world operates. But I appreciate the panel and take that. The other thing, I think one thing, Steve, and you may have focused, and I've been involved with the World Bank and the military. One thing, they don't appreciate a civilian over them. And but what I'm saying is personalities. I don't think we really understand who's head of the World Bank, his or her personality, who's head of our Federal Reserve, and then reverse that to Russia or China. These personalities on a day-to-day basis makes a world of difference. And that's how we get to, I just heard today that we're around the world, somebody's made analysis, there's 42 wars going on. And I don't think we understand, we do too much collective thinking that it's the U.S. military. But there are people in U.S. military with attitudes and stuff, how they feel about China, or the other way around. And second is that I really get concerned each day here in Montana, and I'm in the wheat and cattle business, and we only produce 8 to 10% of the world wheat. But we have some idea we control the products. And I think a lot of times not understanding the commodities, and as Steve mentioned, the resources in some of the groups I'm dealing with, we see the 20-some people or so in this room, in a very short period of time, we're going to have to reduce your resources by 1/3 if we're going to meet up with 9, 10, 11 billion people. So I just leave it with that. I'm not too sure, and I'm probably the oldest person in this room, I'm not too sure that we have the capability. We can think about it, we can enhance it, but I think it's going to take another generation with different attitudes to get things done that Steve has mentioned. And the other thing I do want to bring out, I think we should study personalities quite a bit and how they reflect on a day-to-day basis. The other thing is, if Yellowstone blows, it doesn't make too much difference what we discussed here.
Thank you for that, Marshall. Any other comments from the public at this time? Well,
Do we get to take our pop quiz?
yes, I mean, I was just about to say, I promised a quiz I'm going to deliver. It's just going to be a lot shorter with maybe one question instead of several. So I will get ready for that. Thanks for the question. And in the meantime, if you have any parting comments, you're welcome to make them. Again, I very much appreciate what you've said and done here this evening. And in future occasions, there will be a lot more time for more of that, and a few more people around the table as well. So I look forward to that. Go ahead.
Can I just make one comment? I know, Marshall. I agree absolutely that the 5, 10, 15, 20-year-olds are making, the future, and they're going to be making decisions. I think I think they look to us to help them make some sense of the world in which they live. And I see that with my students with geography. And actually, Steve, you make mention of The Revenge of Geography, and that's a book that we're reading in one of my classes. And the students, all these students that are going to come along someday and make a difference for the world in which all of us live, they're sort of hungry for some guidance and for some information and a hospitable forum in which to discuss their ideas and their frustrations and their confusion. And so that would be my only sort of addition to that comment. And certainly, if we want to talk about personalities, Mr. Putin would get my vote for the interesting personality of the hour.
Thank you very much. So our last act of the evening is to undertake this quiz. I have a tool, a device to assist. You know, we've talked about geographic illiteracy, so this is not an exercise to make anyone think about what they don't know. It should be a way to just sort of regain the knowledge of the world that we all had at one time. So, question. It's a question where you'll need to locate. Anyone in the room can win the prize by answering this question correctly. You need to locate the Strait of Hormuz, which is a geographic choke point on the world. It's only 21 to 60 miles wide throughout its length. It links the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman. It's absolutely essential gateway for Persian Gulf oil to reach Asian, especially Asian and European markets. So, can anyone with this little laser pointer point to the Strait of Hormuz? You're correct. Well, while you're at it, there's another important choke point. Same argument. I mean, the same description. This is an absolutely strategically critical waterway for the transshipment of oil out of the Middle East into Asian markets, particularly Japan. It's called the Strait of Malacca. And John, I'm not going to give you the opportunity to be right twice in a row. So does anybody else want to take a stab at where the Strait of Malacca is located on that map? And if you want to just take a guess and describe it, we can point the laser at it for you. No takers? No. Mr. Driscoll.
Well, I'm having trouble reading the map here.
Yeah.
I'm thinking it's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, just a little bit farther to the west.
yeah, just like right there on the tip, right? Isn't it right there on that tip? Yeah.
It's bordered by Indonesia and Malaysia, and it's a very narrow strait that's essential to oil traffic. So the point is that those two points of Earth are immensely important to everybody who consumes oil. Because if they were to be shut down, and there are plans to shut them down from time to time, Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, and other people have said they could easily close with mines and submarines and other kinds of things, the Strait of Malacca. Well, we can recall that the Second World War in the Pacific was precipitated by the shutting down oil traffic to fuel the Japanese war machine. So these are important parts of the world. Are you okay with one more? One more. This is regarded as a powder keg, the big kahuna in Africa. So the question is, which oil-rich country in Africa is the continent's most populous, most risky with respect to the spread of Ebola, and currently experiencing violent clashes between members of the Islamic extremist group Boko Haram and Christian inhabitants? Anybody want to take a stab at which country is the most populous and the most at risk from this pandemic because of its population and its location?
Isn't it Nigeria?
Yeah. So
take that little laser pointer and
you want me to point it out on the
you got the right country, but you got to
Oh.
tell us where it is.
well, you know, I could show it. Isn't it the big country right kind of in the middle?
If you,
That's the,
Yeah.
is that the Congo? So then it's Nigeria, no, above it. No.
close, you're very warm, very warm.
No, one
Keep
more.
going down.
There.
Bingo.
It's on the coast.
That's Nigeria. And I kind of like to use Nigeria as an example because it's not a country we are accustomed to thinking about very much or talking about in the United States, but it's an amazingly important country in Africa. And if Ebola spreads into Nigeria, the public health officials are worried sick about that because it's so populous. There's so much traffic going in and out of the capital city. It's such a transit point for people all over West Africa. So we can hope that it doesn't happen. So with that, I want to thank you so much again for being here. I look forward to your engagement in the weeks ahead. I want to thank our viewers for tuning in when we eventually televise this statewide. Thank all of you for coming, and I hope you'll tell your friends and neighbors to come for round 2 next week. We'll be talking about sovereignty. And with that, we are done.